what I want to share this morning. And have you ever been driving down the road and you come up on some slow-moving traffic? Every once in a while you get some slow-moving traffic around here. Most of the time they're trying to run over you. But a lot of times you'll get to some slow-moving traffic, and you see a sign that says, slow, men at work, don't you? You've seen signs like that, men at work, slow, men working, things like that. What do? You don't speed up, do you? You start slowing down. You start slowing down. You start looking on the side of the road, trying to see if you see any guys close to the road. Or you drive along there, and when you get to the place where the work site is, you look over and you see the people on the side of the road, and you look over and you take a quick glance and you take a survey of what's over there. And you say, well, there's 20 guys over there working. There's 20 workers. Well, you take a quick census and a survey of what they are. You got 2 supervisors, which you cannot consider them workers because that's not working. You got 6 of them leaning on shovels. All right? You got 3 of them talking on their cell phones. You got 4 guys getting a drink of water around the water jug. You got 1 guy that's in the porta potty, and you got 2 that's standing in line waiting. Then you got this 1 guy driving this big machine, which looks more like playing than it does working. And then you have, which leaves, if you calculated all them up, if you stay with me, it comes up to 19. Then you've got 1 guy. You shovel, moving some dirt out of the way and making things happen. Out of all those people, out of all those 20 workers, you got 1 poor, sweaty soul doing the work. And you think, wow, that's a good use of my money, isn't it? That's a good use of the taxes I pay every time I go to the gas pump and get some gas. Sometimes in life situations, you look at those guys and you think, man, them guys are lazy, aren't they? All of them trying to figure out how to get out of work, and they're just a bunch of lazy no-gooders. But sometimes in life situations, it looks like God's lazy. It looks like He's lazy. He's big-time lazy. Can't God see that there is a lot to be done down here? Can't God grasp? Can't He grasp that the world needs His involvement? They need it now. We need it quickly. Somehow God must be lazy. God needs to get to work. Now, before any of y'all up here start moving away from the lightning striking area, okay? I know that's what y'all's thinking. God's fixing to strike him with lightning. Before y'all start moving away, let me share with you our main scripture text this morning. And it comes out of John chapter 5, verse 17. And this is Jesus speaking. He says, my Father is always working, and so am I. Now, Habakkuk the prophet thought the same way as we do sometimes. He had a complaint because things were getting bad where he was at. They were getting miserable. They were getting to feel hopeless. And the Babylonians had clipped away at the little kingdom of Judea about as much as they could. And there was hardly anything left. But King Jehoiakim, he kept paying tribute every year, year after year, year after year. And Jehoiakim collected taxes. He collected taxes from everybody to pay this tribute. And you can read about that in 2 Kings. verse 20 or chapter 23 if you want to. But Habakkuk's thinking. He's thinking now, Lord, you know that's not right. This is your nation. This king is the rightful king, the rightful descendant of the king of David. This temple is your holy temple. It's in your holy city of Jerusalem, and you have promised to protect it. So get busy, Lord. Get to work, God. Lord, how come you're being lazy? Those are paraphrasing. But Habakkuk said it this way. He said it in the first chapter, starting at verse 2. He said, how long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Violence is everywhere. I cry, but you do not come to save. Must I forever see these evil deeds? Why must I watch all this misery? Wherever I look, I see destruction and violence. I'm surrounded by people who love to argue and fight. The law has become paralyzed, and there is no justice in your courts. In other words, God, how come you're not how is it that you're letting me, your little prophet, stand out here in this hot sun and yell my head off, and you not do nothing? It's useless. You're not doing anything useful. Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever felt like crying out to God? Just do something. Anything to correct what's going on around here. Shots rang out one night in the neighborhood, and somebody was arrested for it. And at the pre-trial hearing, the arresting officer didn't show up. So the case was dismissed. So God, why didn't you do something? A young woman driving in some busy traffic like you do around here bumped into a bicycle. No injuries, no problems, no damage. The guy gets up off the ground, pulls out a gun, and kills the lady in the car. And he come to find out he hadn't been charged anything or arrested or anything been charged to him for similar things that he had done. What's wrong with this system, Lord? Where were you? Can't you do something? God seems lazy, not working like he ought to. And in this life of mine, Lord, in this life of mine, can't you see that I always have more month than I do money? Can't you see that the kids won't obey? Can't you see that my spouse is not doing their share load? I'm just sick of it. Lord, isn't that enough? Isn't that enough for you to get busy? Isn't that enough to keep you busy? Aren't you going to get up off your hind legs? If you read Habakkuk a little further, he'll talk about hind feet. Isn't that enough for you to get up off your hind legs and do something for me? But like Habakkuk, We complain. We complain if God were really good at being God, he would have gotten busy by now. We suspect that God is extremely lazy, lounging around, intoxicated by the sounds of the angelic choir, deaf to our cries. But like Habakkuk said in verse 2 there, he said, "How long, O Lord? How long must I call for help? How long? How long, God, must I deal with this illness? How long must I deal with this sickness? How long must I look for a spouse somewhere? How long must I put up with this loneliness? How long must I put up with this job? How long must I be broke all the time? How long must everything be going wrong in my life? How long? How long? How long?" And the list could go on and on and on and on. Now that I've got you depressed, now that I've got you all sad and mopey and think, "Oh, I'm supposed to come in here and got inspired." Let's change directions here first. Let's change directions where we should be going in this message. All right? Let's look again at our familiar with the song Waymaker, aren't you? Have you ever heard that song? We've sung it a handful of times here at church. It's a very simple and respective song. There aren't many lyrics in it because it's kind of repetitive. There's not very many lyrics in it, but it's amazingly honest. It's amazingly honest and necessary for the heart. The words are what our souls and what our hearts need on a regular basis to remind us that God is always working. No matter what we have seen or not seen, no matter what we are feeling, God doesn't change with the circumstances. Just because things are not around us changing, or they seem uncertain, and they do, don't they? And they are changing, and they do seem uncertain. We need to remember that God is faithful. He is faithful and true to His promises, that He is always working. There are several times it looks like in the Old Testament that the fulfillment of the covenant that God made with Abraham was at risk. Y'all remember the covenant He made with Abraham? He told Abraham that he was going to make a great nation out of Abraham. And He promised that He would return His people to this great land. But Abraham and his wife were old. You know all the stories, so I'm going to kind of run through it kind of quickly. I'm not going to read all of that. But they were old and they didn't have any kids. So how was God going to build a great nation out of Abraham? But God was working on this situation. He was going to provide a son. And He did provide a son. But before that, Sarah and Abraham reached the age. They reached the age in their 90s and near 100. They reached that age that they expected they wouldn't have any children. And the covenant that God made with Abraham looked like it was at risk. Getting impatient when years had passed and they were getting older and nothing had happened, and worried that they wouldn't have any offspring before they had passed away. They took matters in their own hands. Took matters in their own hands, and Sarah convinced Abraham to sleep with her servant, her maidservant, Hagar, to produce offspring this way. That union produced Ishmael. And the Israelites and the descendants of Ishmael have been fighting and warring against each other ever since. But God was working all along in the situation. Sometimes we get impatient, don't we? Sometimes we get impatient and we want to take things in our own hands. That can be a bad thing. That can be a bad thing. Somebody told me the other day that I step on their toes every time I send out a message of the morning that talks about waiting. And we get impatient sometimes. And just like Sarah and Abraham got impatient, and Ishmael come out of that. And then Ishmael and the descendants, when we get impatient. But God fulfilled, and Isaac comes along. And Isaac's a pretty good kid. There's not a whole lot noted about Isaac. When he grows up, Abraham sends a servant to get Isaac a wife. And Isaac doesn't even get to pick one out for himself. How would you guys like that? How would you guys like, don't worry, son, I'm going to send my hired hand over there and he's going to get you a woman? You know, you're thinking, oh my gosh, how's this going to play out? He didn't even get to pick one from the ones he grew up with. He told Abraham, he said, he told his servant, don't let him marry any of these folk around here. But everything turns out okay, and he gets Rebekah. And then there comes Jacob. There comes Jacob, who the covenant was to be fulfilled through. Jacob stole his brother's birthright. And he stole his blessing. And Esau was furious and he vowed to kill him. So what does it do? It looks like the covenant being fulfilled is at risk. It's not going to happen. Jacob runs off. He runs off and spends 20 years with Laban, working for a woman for 14 years and then spending 6 years building his herd. But we tend to imagine Jacob as a scheming young boy, don't we? We kind of look at that and we think, well, he was kind of a young man and Mama was helping him out and teaching him things. But actually, he was around about 70 years old when he ran away from home. Now, back in them days, it might have been a young man. But then he returns home. He returns home and he faces his brother Esau. And instead of getting his revenge and inflicting harm and pain on Jacob, Esau receives his brother with grace, love, and forgiveness. Then there's Joseph, Jacob's son. Joseph was thrown into a pit by his brothers at the age of 17. And he ends up in Egypt, rose in the ranks as a prominent figure, but was falsely accused of sexual conduct and thrown into prison. Here again, the covenant that God made with Abraham looked like it was at risk, wasn't it? It wasn't going to happen. But God delivered him. He delivered him from prison, and he appointed him as second in command over Egypt at 30 years old. And he distributed food during the famine. God used all of this to bring the Israelite people to Egypt, where they could prosper and grow into that great nation that God had promised. Then eventually the Israelites grew in a size that caused the Egyptians to fear them. The Egyptians placed them in slavery to control them. And Pharaoh comes up with this plan. He comes up with this plan to diminish them. He went to the Hebrew midwives. Now, if the Hebrews are outnumbered, you're going to go to the Hebrew midwives to get some help, right? So he went to the Hebrew midwives, and he instructs the midwives to instruct them baby boys. But let the baby girls live. But the two midwives in charge of this was Shiphrah and Puah, if I'm pronouncing them right. The covenant looked like it was at risk again, didn't it? It looked like it was at risk. But these two women disobeyed Pharaoh's orders. They stood up against him. And they allowed the newborn boys to live as well, which allowed the Israelite people to continue to prosper and grow in multitude and numbers. Two women that most people don't know much about. They're mentioned that one time. Were used in a huge way to continue the covenant that God had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God was still working through all of those situations, regardless of when they looked like they were fixing to collapse, fixing to fall apart. This all took place when the things that looked bleak for the Israelites. But do you think in their life situation, as they were going through all of this, that they looked at God like he was lazy? Big time lazy. God, when are you going to do something? Couldn't God see that they needed a lot of help down there? Couldn't God grasp? Couldn't he grasp that the Israelites needed his involvement in their lives? They needed it now. They needed it quickly. They were thinking God must be lazy. God needs to get to work. But God was working the whole time through each of those situations. Look at John 5, verse 17 again. My Father is always working, and so am I. Even when Abraham and Sarah couldn't get pregnant, God was still working. Even when Isaac's future was in the hands of his daddy's hired hand, God was still working. Even when Jacob spent 20 years away from home and feared a reunion with his brother Esau, God was still working. Even when Joseph was sold by his brothers, thrown in a pit, and he was falsely accused and thrown in prison, God was still working. Even when Pharaoh abused the Israelites and tried to weaken them by killing all of their newborn baby boys, God was still working. You know what this shows us? This shows us that He is the same God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and the Israelites as He is today. Just like Miss Katie was talking about. God is faithful. He is faithful to keep His promises. Even when we can't see it, He's working. Even when we don't feel it, He's working. Look at these accounts in the Bible. Each one that I talked to you about. Look at them and put yourself in the shoes of each one of those characters. They went through a great uncertainty. They went through tribulations. To read further into it, we can see how God was working the whole time. We can see how God was working in an incredible way. In the middle of all this, they didn't understand what was happening, did they? Or what God was doing, or why it was taking so long. But God was working. Our hearts need to be constantly reminded that God is working. No matter what we're facing, no matter what we're going through, no matter what we're feeling, none of these change the truth that God is working. What we might seem incomprehensible, I'll get it spit out here in a minute, in our life, that we might seem impossible to understand, may just be God working in an incredible way for our good, for His purpose, for His glory. God is working in our life. We will face a lot of difficult situations. We will have hard times. We will have dry seasons where we feel distant from God. Or that we'll have times that we don't understand what He's doing. It's easy for us to read and see the end of the story, isn't it? To see the end of the story of these characters' lives. And acknowledge that God's hand is in the middle of it. He is working in the midst of it. But it's a lot more difficult. It's a lot harder in our own lives when we don't see the end of it. But we must continue to remind ourselves that God is working. This that we're in, this day and age, this time in history, this time in presence wherever we're at, this is God's story, isn't it? Where we're at is God's story. And how we fit in it is God's plan. We may not see how we fit, but we do fit. I'll close with this. Y'all thinking, dadgum, that was short. Was, wasn't it? I was tricking you. But I hit my tablet and it went bloop. The truth is that we want to see and we want to understand everything that God is doing, don't we? We want to see and understand every minute, every moment of what God is doing. But that's not how God works. The reason we want this is we want to see ourselves at the center of our own story. We're looking for how God is going to intervene in our story, aren't we? The problem is that we have it backwards. We're not in the middle of our own story. We're in the middle of God's story. And He is the center of it. This is His story. And we get to see how we fit. Like to you about in the Bible. Each one of them fit into God's story. We fit into God's story. You and I are someone that is blessed. That is blessed to be created and known by God for the purpose of accomplishing His will. Our circumstances don't determine if God's working. Neither do our feelings. God is always working. Because it's His story. It's not ours. So no matter what we are facing, we can remember that we are part of His incredible story where He's always working. And it's important for us to remember. To remember that you are part of His story, even if you can't see it, even if you can't feel it. Our main text this morning was what? My Father is always working. And don't forget about, and so am I.